Good morning and a very warm welcome to the EPC Weekly Update, our weekly look at the key developments in relation to the COVID-19 crisis and the implications for Europe's economy, society and politics in general. My name is Jackie Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the European Policy Centre, and every week senior analysts join me to assess the latest developments, to evaluate emerging and ongoing measures, and to consider what they mean not just for the short term, but also the EU's long-term future. Joining me this week, we will have Lionel Barber, former editor of the Financial Times. He's also a former Brussels bureau chief from the early 90s, so he knows this city very well. And he's a new member of the European Policy Centre's Strategic Council. I also have, as usual, Janis Emmanouilidis, Director of Studies at the EPC, and Fabian Zuleeg, who is, of course, the Chief Executive. We're going to start this week with an assessment of the outcome of the EU leaders' virtual summit yesterday, billed as yet another make or break moment for the EU. And then we're going to turn to a discussion on the broader questions about the economic impact of the crisis, both now and in the longer term, drawing in particular on a paper written by Fabian Zuleeg, an in-depth briefing paper, discussion paper on that economic impact and what the EU has to do. We're going to come to that later. We'll start with the summit. Before we start, just the usual housekeeping notes. Your microphones are muted. If you want to ask a question when I open up to the floor, you can click on the little handshake button and put your hand up virtually, and I will see it come up. Or you can put your question, there's a button marked questions, write your question in there. Could I repeat my plea that you keep your written questions short? I'm going to make a suggestion because people are still writing small essays that are quite hard for me to read quickly while moderating. Could we try and keep it to maybe tweet length or less? Let's have a go at that. Just to say, we have over 300 of you attending today, so we may not get to all your questions. If your questions are technical or relate to issues we've discussed previously or are going to look at in more depth later on, we'll try to come back to you in writing afterwards, and as I say, come back to many of these issues in the weeks to come. So let's get started. And as I say, we want to start. And Lionel, welcome to you, a very warm welcome. It's wonderful to have you on board today. And I just want to start with an assessment of the summit. It was billed yet again as a make or break moment, a moment of truth, whatever form of hyperbole you prefer. Question, it was very short, unlike the finance ministers meeting of the previous week. Janis, can I just start with you in terms of, was it the damp squib that some people are saying, I didn't do much, didn't try to do much and achieve little, or behind the scenes, was there more important progress that might be obvious to start with?
No, I think that we did not see major progress, but I think that the expectations ahead of the summit should have been not too high anyhow. So all those who were talking about a make or break summit or a moment of truth, I think they were exaggerating. If I would characterize the summit, I would say that it was more of a typical EU summit in atypical times. What do I mean by that? I think some of the decisions which we already knew were just reconfirmed with respect, for example, to main elements of the overall package, the economic and fiscal package. We saw that the can was further kicked down the road. The Commission now has things to do. The Euro group will have to come back to the issue of the recovery fund. And we also saw that the summit did not provide detailed guidelines, orientations to what now should be done. So in many ways, that is what we have seen also in many summits in the past, also before COVID-19. But the question is that enough? Given also what we will be discussing about later on with respect to the severity of the economic crisis, is the fact that we do not have now an additional step in the right direction. Is that enough or is it not enough? When you were following how experts were discussing yesterday about the summit, where some were saying the glass is half full, others were saying it's half empty. So it's extremely difficult to give a final verdict of what will come out of this, but definitely this summit was not a moment of truth, and actually it did not deliver high results.
Yeah. But Fabian, maybe it was wise that they didn't try for high results, because what we've seen, the pattern of previous week, is when they don't get anywhere, the headlines are terrible, the public perception that the EU is not responding. So I'm thinking certainly the mood seemed calmer. There were no exchanges, bad-tempered exchanges of the previous weeks. Was it maybe wise to have a relatively low-key summit now, set a bit of direction, although as Janis was saying, not much. They didn't talk about the size of the recovery fund, what form it will take. But was that maybe a more sensible strategy than lots of pre-hype? A thought from you, and then I'll come to Lionel. Fabian first.
Yeah, I think what we can't afford is the kind of spectacle we have seen over the last weeks, that we have very high level discussions which in many cases have ended up with language which didn't help finding a solution, with absolutist statements being made about what has to happen now, what is absolutely essential or what can't happen. Now we have a much more collaborative approach. Yes, it doesn't go far enough, and I think we can already say it's not going to go far enough, but it will come back, and we will have many of these discussions over the next weeks, over the next month, over the next years, because this is not a crisis which is going to be over and done with at any point soon. So I think it is good that we are back to the European compromise mode, which I think is really what is needed at this point. And I think it is a starting point for more, but clearly it has to be a starting point. It cannot be the end of the process.
And Lionel, I mean, this constant talk, as I say, I mean, in general terms, and it's a question I've asked all our guests on this weekly update. So I want to ask you, do you see this for the EU, not yesterday's summit in particular, but more generally? Do you see it in these, if I can use the word apocalyptic terms, of make or break moment for the European Union, the moment when it proves that it really can act, or it falls apart? Or is that sort of language not helpful? How do you see this in terms of the challenge facing the European Union now?
Well, first of all, the institution that matters and that has acted decisively after an initial wobble is the European Central Bank. And that's what really counts at the moment. Second is this was not a breakthrough summit, it was a smart summit. And what I mean by that is Germany was clearly not going to move. Angela Merkel is not going to agree to Corona bonds. That's off the table. And therefore, you have to look at this in terms of a European recovery fund with a big number, and there is a big number. Ursula von der Leyen is talking about $1 trillion. It's at least 750, 800 billion, number one. Number two, you've got a multi-year financial perspective. That's always going to be difficult. You and I know from the old days, these packages take ages, everybody's wrangling, but it's there. And it's going to be a bigger number than say 1.1% of gross domestic product, which by the way is going to be smaller, that GDP, because of the catastrophic hit to growth. And the third point is, you know, this talk of the hour of Europe, we know where that led in 1991 in the Balkan Wars, and it was humiliating for the EU. You can only move with the Germans. The Germans are not ready. There will be a substantial commitment. It's got to be complementary to the ECB. So I think relax a bit.
Thank you very much. And that point about the Germans and moving, Janis, we did see Angela Merkel before the summit talking to the Bundestag, was talking about being prepared now to put substantial money behind this. So we have seen a movement, and it seems that now the central question for the recovery fund is, are we talking grants or are we talking loans? Or what is the mix of the two? Where over the coming weeks and months do you expect that to come out? And would you share Lionel's assessment that Corona bonds just ain't going to happen effectively?
Yes, Corona bonds, Euro bonds, all these things definitely are not going to happen, because these are red lines which not only Germany but also others are not ready to cross. But there is movement. If you follow what Merkel has been saying, what Finance Minister Scholz has been saying, they're preparing the grounds also in the German public debate. They're seeing that there is a need to add a European dimension to the recovery something to what is already being done at the German level, the national level. And they're preparing for a bigger MFF. They're preparing for higher contributions of Germany to EU budgets in the next years. So they are preparing the ground slowly. But as Lionel was indicating, as you were asking, there are a lot of questions which still need to be settled. Lionel was referring to the size of the recovery package, fund, whatever you want to call it. And there are a lot of numbers which are out there, also going beyond the 1 trillion. But then again, is the 550 billion already included in these numbers of the 3 other elements of the package which we have now put together, ESM, EIB, the SURE program? So there are a lot of questions with respect to that. Yes, there's a big question as to how that money will be spent. Are we talking about grants, transfers? Are we talking about loan and credits? And here the positions divert a lot between member states, which makes me think that at the end we will come up with a mix, which includes both obviously loans and which then means new debt for some member states, but it also will have to include grants and transfers, probably mostly through the MFF. Then there's the question of what we will be spending the money on. Is it on which sectors will the money be spent? What will it actually be spent for? And here the Germans and Angela Merkel is saying we need first an analysis of the state of our economies and which sectors actually need money. She wants that kind of an analysis before decisions are taken with respect to how much money and where it should be coming from. And then comes the big final question is, how will all that be financed? Yes, everybody knows it's going to be part of the MFF, but there's also this idea of borrowing on the market, so leveraging. So a lot of questions.
I'll tell you one thing, Janis. I'll make a little prediction. A lot of those loans are going to turn into grants.
Eventually, the ECB will help.
Fabian, the mix. What are your expectations, drawing on what has happened over the last couple of weeks, the tone of the debate yesterday? What are your expectations for what we will see, for example, on May 6th? Ursula von der Leyen has given a date for her new budget proposals, a little slap over the wrist there, allegedly, during the summit, when Angela Merkel said, make sure you tell us first. Wonder what that was all about. But what is your expectation for what the Commission will propose and how member states are likely to react?
I mean, I think it's important to emphasize again that this is not about a single instrument. This is about a range of different measures which are being taken by a range of different institutions. I think one thing which also should be a little bit more in the focus at the moment is the coordination of national action. We know that from the last economic crisis, there's a lot of spillover within the single market. So having coordination of the national actions which are being taken will also add to the overall scope and scale of the intervention which can be done. But I think what we can expect, yes, we will see a proposal now on the 6th of May. I think what we saw with Chancellor Merkel coming in was a message to say that we know that Germany will have to foot the bill here. So if Germany has to foot the bill, you better check first what Germany is willing to do. And I think this is where we are going to have also some limitations on this. And we shouldn't forget that, yes, we are talking about a much bigger MFF, but it is still a relatively small part of the European economy. And I think there are still a number of issues which haven't been addressed. And that's maybe one of the signals from Merkel as well, is how are we going to deal with, for example, the democratic issue, the rule of law issue? Is there going to be some kind of strong mechanism, or will we simply accept that the money which will be there will also go to countries like Hungary, Poland, to the same extent as it does now?
Okay, quick question to you, Lionel, also in relation to expectations and your bet that you just made with Janis, and then I'll go out to the room. If I could ask you to confine any questions at the moment to the summit yesterday, not broader issues, because then we're going to come to the broader issues. But Lionel, in terms of your expectations and your prediction is based on political feasibility, as I understand it from your previous remarks? What is
Well,
doable?
yeah, first of all, it's really important to understand the German position, because again, nothing is going to happen unless this Germany is comfortable. And I think Germany is just saying we can't just have unconditional aid assistance on a grand scale. So what Fabian was saying is completely right. This is why there's an obstacle to Corona bonds, which is just, and once you do that, you're in a completely different territory, right, on mutualization of debt. I think a key principle is to think back at 20 years ago, when there was a debate about cohesion funds with the Mediterranean countries coming in. The principle of north-south solidarity and actually north-east solidarity it's a given in the EU. The only issue is, what are the new conditions? Because the size of the money, the scale of what is required is so much bigger.
And on that question of the scale, I see two questions have come in. One saying, if I got it right, it looks like the budget will come out much larger than it ever was. MFF at 1% no longer an option. And another person saying, both in the case of loans and grants from the ECB, the EU budget will need to be the guarantee. So whatever happens, the MFF must increase. Is that correct? And are we really looking at, people are talking about 2% of GDP instead of 1%? Well, Fabian, is it likely? Sorry, I'll come to Fabian first, then to you, Lionel. Fabian.
I think, as we know from looking at future MFFs, it's always a little bit of a discussion what the figures actually really mean. What we're going to have is not necessarily what is going to be spent. We will have envelopes, we will have commitments, and in that there will also be a number of areas where we're talking about using the EU budget as guarantees for lending. There's the mechanism we've established with the Juncker Fund and the EIB being involved in that. So all of that will feature. I think the other part which is important here is, and I don't know how the Commission is going to deal with that, is that the framework conditions have changed completely. So for me, one of the big questions is, how big is the impact on GDP going to be? Yeah. And what does that then mean in terms of the GDP contribution of member states? And also, we will have countries in severe fiscal distress. So a number of countries might not actually be able to pay in their contributions at the point when it is needed. So there also needs to be some form of borrowing facility, some form of being able to bridge these kind of situations. But in the end, I think what is really important is that we focus on getting something through. It doesn't really matter so much what is actually in there, but we need that vehicle in place, because the worst of all worlds is that we can't start spending any of this money because the MFF is not in place, and we are quickly running out of time.
And a suggestion there from many people that cannot be done without a physical meeting of the EU summit. You can't do it by Zoom or any other of these mechanisms that we're using, and goodness knows when they'll be able to have a physical summit. But Lionel, you wanted to come in here, and then we're going to move to the broader economic implications. Lionel.
Well, I hate to be the party pooper here, but the point is, you could be seeing a hit to growth in the EU of maybe 15% in 2020. The number, at least 7%. So if you have that hit to growth, just talking about 1% doesn't work, because you're going to get a serious cut in real terms, at least in the initial phase. Second point is, ladies and gentlemen, you're not going to have the British contribution to help on the MFF. The UK, before it left, was a net contributor.
Yeah. Janis, just a couple of quick questions that have just come in. When would the recovery fund kick in if it was linked to the MFF? Going back to that point about negotiations are running late, we're running out of time. And another question, what is your assessment on the chances for new own resources? That perennial debate, any chance it will have a different answer in light of what's happened. Quick ones, if you would, because I'd like to turn to the broader economic implications, building on what Lionel was just saying. Janis, please.
With respect to the timing, we don't know. The idea is that you would actually now, because of the increased pressure, come to an MFF deal fast enough to have things running from early 2021. That's very ambitious, because not only what we saw in February, how different the positions are, getting all that together despite the COVID-19 pressure won't be easy. We're talking about the German presidency. I think this is where we potentially could, the earliest, have an agreement. And I think that the German government and Angela Merkel herself will invest some of her political capital into this. She will want to get an agreement on the MFF. And that's also why she's preparing her own audience. She actually wants that agreement. But the agreement means among 27. And things have not become easier. If you look, for example, of the issues, and Fabian was indicating that it was related to the rule of law. We're not now in an easier position than we were in February. So getting an agreement among 27 will be extremely difficult. So there's a risk, and Fabian was indicating that we might not get to an agreement. That would be the worst of outcomes. So yes, there is a lot of political pressure now, but getting actually to an MFF deal, which everybody, all member states agree to, will not be easy.
And own resources? The EU having its own resources? Very briefly.
Well, that could be part of the package, but I think it's far too early to say in which way. There are a lot of ideas which are floating out there, a lot of ideas which have already been floating before the COVID-19 crisis erupted, and there was not a big appetite on the side of member states, but we'll see. Maybe it could be part of a very complex package.
Okay, let us turn now to these broader economic implications. And as I mentioned at the beginning, and many of you will have seen, yesterday afternoon, the EPC published an in-depth paper by Fabian on the economic impact of the crisis. Fabian, turn to you first. You entitled your paper "From the Frying Pan into the Fire." Why that title? What's behind that?
What is behind that is that I think when we look at the discussion around the economic impact, we are thinking too short term at the moment. Yes, we will have an economic crisis, which is happening right now because of the restrictions which are there. It makes a lot of the economic activity, which normally takes place, impossible to do. And of course, that is having a big impact on GDP. But once restrictions will be loosened, you will have a certain amount of rebound. If the restaurants open again, if people are traveling again, there will be people going back to work which haven't been able to work. But this will not be the recovery. That will just a rebound, which will only be time limited. And from that point onwards, we are really facing the economic crisis. It is that longer term economic crisis, which is going to be hitting our economies across the board, where we will have a very severe impact. We're talking about numbers which are almost unimaginable. If we're looking at the forecast, 15%, we were talking about a number of 5% when we're talking about the economic and financial crisis. And now we're talking about an average of 15%. And it might be more. And the big question is also the duration of that second phase. Is it going to be something which is short and sharp? What we've seen again in the economic and financial crisis was, at least in some countries, a short and sharp recession with a quick recovery. Here we're talking about big structural changes, a long-term slump, which is also global. We have the global impact, which is feeding into that. So all of that indicates, in my view, that we have to concentrate much more on that longer term issue. We have to think about what kind of policies are appropriate for that kind of slump. It is not the same policies which we are applying right now. Right now, it is about keeping businesses afloat over this period. In the longer term, we have to think differently. So it is about understanding things better so that we have the right policy response.
And do you think that government leaders, the public, do you think that debate is being prepared, that there's an understanding that the responses will need to be different in the different phases? Or do you think people are still really locked into that what we need to do now to stop companies from going under? And there's not enough thinking about the future, which is also playing into why the debate on the recovery fund has taken a while to get going. Do you think there's a realization of what you're highlighting here so strongly?
I think there's a realization in some places, but this is also politically difficult. The message to people is that it's not just about getting through this current period. It is about having a much more longer haul of a very, very difficult situation. But I think it's also, in many ways, we are reacting to the situation. And while these messages are not very comforting, I think we have to start thinking about this longer term slump, because this is when we really are going to see permanent damage being done to economies. And we will have to find ways of also prioritizing, because it's not going to be possible to do everything at the same time as having to do a lot. Governments are going to be in a much weaker position. They're going to have a much worse fiscal position. They're going to be supporting a lot of businesses permanently. The tax take is going to be disastrous. And incidentally, just as a footnote on the own resources, I would like to see what kind of own resources we're talking about, which will actually have a stable revenue in the next few years. If we're talking about something like, for example, an environmental tax, where we've seen a lot less economic activity, that's not going to do it. So I think we are in a world where we really have a lot of these uncertainties, but we need to start thinking about what these might imply for policy, because otherwise we're in big danger of either using too much of the resources too quickly without the effect which we want, or even worse, spending money on the wrong things and then not having the firepower to address the real crisis.
So Lionel, we hear a lot of talk about the shape of whatever recovery comes. Is it V-shaped? Is it U-shaped? Is it L, most people's worst scenario, or the worst of all, a double dip, a W? What do we know about what is like? You underlined the scale of this, as did Fabian. What's the new normal going to be when we come out of this immediate phase? What will we be confronting, do you think?
Well, I don't see just a snapback, a V-shaped recovery. I mean, that implies that we do go back to the world, if you like, of yesterday. Full global travel, planes full, borders open, free movement, solid growth. I mean, can you imagine what's happened to America compared to what was being predicted, forecast a year ago? So I can't tell you exactly where it's going to be. We hope, obviously, you. But I just want to make another very important point. When you were asking about government response, we're still in the middle of a health crisis. A public health crisis. 1 or 2 countries have done, if you like, better than others, Germany, Switzerland being among them. But other countries, they're still in the middle of it. We're not going to even see the lockdown released until, say, second week May. So while this is occurring, all the emphasis is get cash to business, help, and that's, by the way, not happening. It's certainly not in this country, not fast enough. But go back then to what Fabian is saying, right? What is the damage, and who's going to survive? When government is handing out support, financial support, by the way, loans are being turned into grants. That means that government's going to be involved. Who gets to survive? Who doesn't? All these are hugely complicated and very, very difficult political trade-offs. We're going to hear a lot more about that in May than we are in April.
And indeed, Fabian, your paper talks about that differentiated impact on sectors. So we're talking aviation, countries that are particularly reliant on particular sectors as well, those heavily dependent on tourism, going to be harder hit. And you make the point as well that the starting positions are different here. But given all of this, Janis, we're talking about a new normal, and we don't know what that new normal will be yet, because as Lana was saying, we're still in the midst of the crisis. How do we devise policies? How do we get the policy response right when we don't know precisely what it is we're going to be responding to? And how are we going to calibrate it at the European level, given these differentiated impacts?
I think given this, that we are just in the beginning of this crisis, I think a key element will be to be transparent and to tell people the truth. This is just the beginning. Many people are still dealing with the health crisis. This is what they have particular in mind. But there will be an economic crisis. It could also have financial impacts, and this will last long. It will have severe effects, as everybody has already said. But there are also other dimensions to the crisis, and all these dimensions are linked to it. I think we're already seeing in some countries, in the US, it's strongest, some societal divides within member states. I think that will increase and make the recovery much more difficult. I think there will be political effects of this crisis, which we're not seeing yet. There are many who are saying that those in power are doing well, the establishment has a grip on things. We cannot say what things will look like in 6 months or a year's time. And the geopolitical consequences of this crisis, we're also not aware of. And all that interplays with each other. They're not separate issues, they're things which are interlinked. And I think we need to increase the debate about potentially what could happen in order to now take the right decisions. You can avoid a lot of the worst potential scenarios. You can't do that.
I just want to come in on.
But in order to do that, you need to be sincere about what potentially could happen in order to get support what will have to be done at national level, at European level, and at global level.
Yeah, just very briefly, what Janis is saying about political consequences is really important. Populism has been on the rise in, if you like, the relatively good times. Obviously, fears about immigration, others were stoking this. Can you imagine what the picture might look like if lots of these small businesses employing 15, 20 people? I'm thinking Italy, which has a very strong small business community. If these businesses go under, this is quite shocking, or potentially shocking.
I think the strategist.
There is a risk here, is there not? When Janis talks about being honest, the difficulty now is that big government is back. And we are seeing governments who used to say, to use a famous phrase from the British political debate, conservative governments used to say there is no magic money tree when they were asked to spend a lot of money on something. And now people are saying, hey, when you need a magic money tree, there is one. So the expectation of government is going to be so huge. But as you pointed out at the beginning, they will be fiscally weaker. How on earth are they going to be able to respond to that level of expectation and not allow, to pick up on Lionel and Janis's point, the populists to seize on the inevitable disappointment because they're so overstretched?
I think we will see that it differs between different countries. I think we have to be clear that not all countries have the same capability. And in those countries where the economic crisis will be deepest, will be longest, where it affects also, as Lionel was saying, in some countries it will affect a lot of small businesses, which will potentially go out of business in the coming month. In those countries, there will be the temptation to go for the easy answers of the populists. The populists will offer a world in which they say this is caused by someone else, it is caused by the wrong choices which are being made. And I think we also have to be aware that mistakes will be made in this. We don't know exactly what to do in all circumstances. I think, for example, one of the biggest areas of uncertainty is how quickly and what kind of restrictions to loosen. If we get that wrong in any country, and there is a second wave of the pandemic, and you have a second period of lockdown, you will also have devastating economic effects. So if a government gets this kind of thing wrong, also in comparison to what is happening in the rest of Europe and the rest of the world, then this will open the door for the opposition, whether populist or other parties, to come in and say, we have been served badly by this particular government. So I think there's a lot of potential for this political upheaval, but also a lot of differences. And that's something we also will have to deal with at the European level, that we will have. In some countries, populists will get back into government in the near future, and we have to answer the question of how we deal with that within the current framework.
Okay, quick point.
Short one, if you would. Lots of questions coming in.
It's just a quick point. The answer is, you asked about what government should say. Take a leaf out of Angela Merkel's book. She was early in managing expectations. The biggest challenge since World War II. This kind of talk actually will win over the silent majority.
Okay, I want to ask you all 2 quick questions, and then we're going to go out to the room. Lots of hands going up, lots of written questions coming in, and it relates to going back to our conversation about the role of the EU in this, because in your paper, Fabian, you say Europe needs to deliver fast and decisive action. You repeat your plea for unconditional solidarity. We talked about that also last week. You said this should be Europe's prime hour. The question really is, will it be? And linked to that, the global perspective. We haven't talked so much about that, but you talk again in the paper about the interdependencies and the risks in this current environment. We have a my country first mentality, a sense of I really need to focus completely on what is happening at my national level. So in terms of the EU role, and then looking at the G7, the G20, those bodies that really for the moment seem relatively ineffective, how do you see and what's your assessment of whether the EU can step up and whether it can get the global level to step up, as it were? Thoughts from you all on that? Who would like to come in first? Wave at me, as I can't see your eyes. Fabian, just in terms of Europe, you said it needs to be fast and it needs to be decisive. We're seeing it's quite hard to be fast. We talked about the time frame before. Will it be fast enough?
Well, what is fast enough? I think faster is better, but we also have to live with the political realities that we are not a single centralized government which can simply turn on the taps if they choose to do so. We are a union of 27 member states where you will have to get agreement between those member states, and in particular, as Lionel has emphasized, some member states which have to be on board. So it does take longer, but I think my general point was really to say that we are not going to move away from a world of interdependence, from a world of spillovers. This is a prime example of something which doesn't stop at borders, and the long-term economic impact is also not going to stop at borders. So unless we are finding a way of also acting across borders, this will be a crisis which will get worse rather than better. And I think this is something we should also have at the global level. I think at the global level, it is even more difficult than within the European Union. But clearly what will happen in the US, what will happen in China, will have a massive impact also on the European Union.
Because we haven't talked so much about that, Lionel, but we see the numbers, the unemployment figures in the US, we see the impact on the US economy. China, we don't yet know the degree of the impact on their economy. This global perspective and what happens elsewhere in the world and how it feeds back into that debate at EU level, how do you see that?
I think a huge amount does depend on the US. We don't know how quickly that can come back. I think there's a lot of pressure in the States to restore economic activity, but it'll be staggered. But I think the hit in 2020 will be severe. China is coming back more. Big questions about second order pandemic and that. I just want to say, in terms of definition of success, look, if Angela Merkel can get a deal on the multi-year financial perspective, that's great. I think if you can sign off on a package of 750, 800, near trillion, that'll be enough frankly. I think there's a big question, lastly, about third order countries. You know, what happens in Africa? What happens to these more vulnerable countries if they fall apart? Then you could get immigration waves. So let's not lose sight of what we used to call the third world.
Okay, let's take, Janis, if you'll bear with me for a moment. I want to go out to the room because lots of questions are coming in here. And we have one, and I will unmute you, so hopefully this will work, from Olivia Butelis-Taft. Olivia, are you there? Doesn't appear to be now, but he also wrote his question earlier, so I can deliver it for him. I'm surprised no one speaks about the need for systemic reform to prepare for the next crisis, which will be environmental, and perhaps the last one. I'm not sure what he means about the last part of that. But again, and I think this links very much into something, Fabian, you talk about in the paper about those other issues and when the recovery, the risk, and we talked about this in a previous weekly update, that governments will focus so much on jobs and growth that the sustainability issues and so on get put on the back burner. Let's take a couple more. Fraser Cameron, are you there? Fraser? No, hang on. I think I may be doing something to turn your mics off instead of on. So Fraser, could you put your hand up again and I'll try again? And then, yeah, hang on a second. Okay, Fraser, you have the mic.
Okay, we're taking advantage of Lionel because Fabian has been obviously arguing that there should be an extension of the Brexit deal. And what kind of Brexit will have an obvious economic impact, not just for the budget, but for the economies of Britain and the EU. You know Boris better than most, Lionel. How do you rate the chances of him when he meets Ursula in June agreeing to an extension?
Well, they're saying categorically no extension, but that's, I think, largely driven by the need to address a very current health crisis. I would bet towards the end that there probably would be a short extension, but they in their bones and Boris's bones, I think they really don't want to do it. But Brexit is just so second order right now.
Yeah, and we will hear today, of course, a round of negotiations this week, which are ending, I think, as we speak. We will see where we are with all of that, but not very high expectations. Fabian and Janis, there's a couple of questions relating to, we talked about structural change, and there's a question about the impact of all of this on production processes. Are we even sure, questioner says, that large-scale shortages on consumer products will not occur? And we have other questions about the impact on the industrial strategy and, you know, what restructuring of industry. A reaction and comment on that, if you will. Who would like to go first this time?
Fabian.
Fabian first, and then Janis. Yeah.
I mean, I think what I also try to emphasize in the paper is that there are going to be large-scale structural changes.
Yeah.
We can already see some of them. I think it is clear that, for example, when it comes to traveling, when it comes to tourism, things will not just go back to normal. When we're looking at a number of sectors, there will be excess supply. We will have a much larger supply than we will need, and that will entail that certain activities will simply not come back after this lockdown crisis, or will come back in a very reduced way. And I think there also governments need to coordinate because that excess supply is across borders. If you look at aviation, for example, we are going to have to find some kind of solution to reduce the amount of flights which would be available in normal times. But we will also have shortages in some areas. There's already excess demand in some areas. I mean, obviously, when you're looking at the healthcare sector, there are areas of excess demand there. We will continue to have logistical challenges. One of the things which we have actually seen in a number of countries is not necessarily the availability of particular products, but it's how you actually get them to the consumers of those. And that is going to be a bit easier once restrictions are loosened, but it's not going to simply go back to the way it was before. I think in the long term, there will also be big changes in terms of supply chains, and that will differ between different sectors. And again, it is something we should be starting to think about. We should be starting to prepare now. I think it is right that in some areas we can also have a positive influence there. We can push it towards a more sustainable direction, but that will take thought. It is not something which is going to happen automatically. I think there is an idea now that because we are seeing some of these impacts, that somehow there will be an automatic movement towards a more sustainable and more just economy. I think this is very much a policy choice, and it has to be decided upon, and then it has to be pushed in all the instruments which government is putting on the table now.
But you very clearly are not predicting the end of globalization. You make that clear in the paper, but it's a different sort of globalization.
I think globalization will have different features, but I think we should also be careful that we're not looking at globalization as somehow the negative thing which has caused all this. Globalization is also the answer to many of the issues which we are facing now. We will be in a situation where we will have to rely also on the global economy, on global supply chains. So it's a much more differentiated picture, and I think, as Lionel has already emphasized, we also are dependent on global developments. So the idea that we can somehow shut Europe off from what is happening elsewhere is an illusion.
Thank you. And Lionel, a comment to that, and if you would also answer a question from John Kerr, a written question on the industry you know best. How much of Europe's media will survive, and how different do you think the media scene will be? So the broad issues Fabian was raising and that specific question. Thank you very much, John Kerr. Lionel.
Well, just on globalization is not this is not a zero-sum game. It's not all or nothing. Things will change. There may well be certain, in global supply chains, there may be certain sub-products, areas where governments want to, if you like, take back control and not be so dependent on China. It's a big question. We shouldn't see it as all or nothing. On the media, I mean, I really worry about those media groups that did not make the shift properly to a subscription model where they're asking for paid for content. I worry a lot about local newspapers. And I think the third point is that the big tech giants, those cash-rich, huge profit-making machines, are going to become even more powerful now. I'm not just talking about Netflix stock. I'm looking at Google. I'm looking at Facebook. They are now. They're not going to buy a local newspaper, but they are going to have control more bits, if you like, of the media ecosystem. But of course, one or two brands, true global brands like the Financial Times. I'm social distancing, by the way, from the FT at the moment. I think they'll survive.
Thank you. Janis, can I ask you to pick up on a question that's been raised? It links back to our conversation about the MFF and the size of the MFF. And it says, you know, somebody who's been involved in the translation of summit conclusions saying EU responses are all about leveraging money. It's not about fresh money. So when we talk about, you know, doubling the size of the GDP contribution and so on, we're not talking about real money. That's really the question. And also on this question of systemic reform, and that links back to the whole conditionality point, which was very fiercely contested in the finance ministers' meetings, the degree to which you tie any help you give countries now to systemic reform for the long term. Pick up on those two briefly, if you would, and then we'll have to draw some conclusions.
Well, with respect to the MFF, I think we will see a combination. Compared to what we had on the table in February, what was discussed among EU leaders in February, I think we will see an increase in real money. So there will be additional money which will have to be put into the MFF, also because of the GDP effect of which we've talked about earlier. But at the same time, the actual increase will come from the leveraging. increasing the headroom, the ceilings to 2%, at least for some years, and using that headroom in order to leverage the money on the financial markets. This is the basic idea. So I think we're going to see a combination of both real money and leveraged money on financial markets. With respect to structural change, systemic reform, two remarks. One is, obviously this crisis is showing that also at European level, a lot of things will have to change. And I find it interesting that over the past week, past 2 weeks, that we have an increasing discussion about something which some at least were already discussing before the COVID-19 crisis broke up, which is the so-called Conference on the Future of Europe. And I think that in the context of this crisis, we will have an intense debate, more intense debate than we had before the crisis erupted, of what this conference potentially might be about in terms of reforming the European Union, which can mean a lot of things. With respect to the question which Olivier asked, because he was more concrete when it comes to climate and environmental issues, I think that they will get under pressure. They are already under pressure. You have a lot of voices saying, how can we, in times in which we are suffering so much in our real economy, think about future generations, which is wrong, but still there is this argument which is being made. But I think there are things which really make sense. And I think there are parts of this idea of green being part of the growth strategy of the future, which I think will also find itself in the recovery plan of what will actually be decided when we get to that point. Will it lead to reforms at national level? It will have to. But tying any kind of solidarity or assistance to reforms at national level, for example, to how we do pension reform or labor reform, would be the wrong signal. Because this crisis is still a health crisis. So we should not tie it to conditionality which go beyond that.
Okay, we're almost out of time, and I just want to apologies to those whose questions we didn't get to. As I say, we will come back on some of the issues you're raising, and we will reply, EPC staff will reply in writing where they can. But I want to come back finally, Fabian, to the closing sentence of your paper, where you say fundamentally, the key lesson is that at a time when many instincts point to greater focus on the national level and greater sovereignty and self-reliance, the best answer lies in greater cooperation, at the very least at the European level. Based on what we have seen so far, and both the substance and the mood at yesterday's EU leaders virtual summit, do you believe that that enlightened self-interest you talk about, recognizing that that cooperation at European level is in your enlightened self-interest, are you optimistic that it means that in the end, maybe with some fits and starts, EU leaders will step up to the plate? Question to all three of you, and then we will close. Fabian first.
I think the question here is, what do you mean in the end? I think what we're going to see over the next weeks, month, is that progressively, yes, more will happen. We will see additional steps driven by necessity. I would agree with Lionel. A lot of the loans will start turning into grants or turning into very, very long-term loans with very favorable conditions, which look increasingly like grants. We will have more action, but this is not going to be easy, also politically. We will have to have agreement on things like the MFF, and we need to get that done without the acrimonious fighting we have seen in some instances in the last weeks. So that we also can portray a European Union which is acting together. But to come back to what I was saying at the beginning of this, I think the real question comes in the next phase. It's what will happen once this longer term deep crisis hits us, once we start seeing permanent increases in unemployment, for example, not just the temporary situation we have now, but people actually being let go, companies closing, factories closing. That's when the real test is going to be. Are governments still going to be able to work together under those circumstances, especially if you see the differentiated impact, if you see also the differentiated political impact that is going to have? That will be the real test.
Okay, quick one if you would, Janis, because I'd like to give Lionel the last word.
I'll try to be a bit more optimistic. We've been very negative today, and I think for good reasons. But if I look back at where we were in 2010 at the beginning of the so-called euro area crisis, it took us an amazing amount of time to get our act together. Not days, not weeks, months, years. Now we're still in the beginning of this crisis. We're weeks into this crisis, and some things have happened. Lionel was referring to a key decision with respect to what the ECB has done with respect to its PEP program. It took that rather early, even without the political backing, because politics has not yet delivered, but the ECB is trying to do its best, and that is a major thing. The fact that we, within weeks, were able to agree on the first elements of the package with respect to the EIB, the ESM, the SURE mechanism, 540 billion euros worth, that is something which took us weeks, and it shall be operational at the beginning of June. So I think there is a sense of urgency. And as things will develop, and we will see what Fabian was indicating with respect to the economy, but also other potential consequences of this crisis, as we will see them unfold, the pressure will further increase. And just closing with that, referring to something which Lionel said earlier, people like Angela Merkel have realized that. They have realized that you now need to correspond in a massive way. They are convinced that this needs to happen, and that's a good sign.
Thank you. Lionel, glass half full, glass half empty. What's your feeling? Can we end on an upbeat note here or on a very downbeat one?
Now, the glass is half full, and it might go down a little bit, but I'm very cautiously optimistic based on two things. And I'm really repeating in different words what's just been said. First of all, the ECB has acted decisively, and there is a good parallel with 2010. Remember that this was a half-baked monetary union. The economic bits were not there. The crisis fighting measures, this EFSF, the emergency fund, none of all this was incremental. It took something really decisive in 2012 with the European Central Bank. We've got that. Second point is when it really gets difficult, later this year, early next year, the test will be, do national governments go their own way, or can the EU Commission, working with the big states like Germany, hold the ring? That will be the test.
And on that note, I wish we could give you a real round of applause. I'm giving you a virtual one in my head. Thank you so much, Lionel, particularly for joining us. It's great to have you on board at the EPC. It's great to have you on the Strategic Council. And thank you so much for making the time today. Thank you to Janis. Thank you to Fabian. And if you haven't read the paper yet, I do urge you to do so. It was published yesterday afternoon. So thank you to all three of you. But most of all, thank you to all of you for attending. Next week, we are going to have our weekly update on Thursday, April the 30th, instead of May the 1st, give you the bank holiday off. It will be at the usual time, though, at 11 o'clock. And we want to focus a little bit more on the whole question of the international dimension. We've talked about it today, that global perspective. Giovanni Grevi, who is the head of the Europe in the World program and a senior fellow at the EPC, has written a number of papers already since the COVID-19 crisis began on this issue. He had one this week on Europe's path to strategic recovery, brace, empower and engage. You can read that, but please, if you can, do join us next week for the weekly update. In the meantime, thank you again, gentlemen, to all three of you. Thank you for watching and being with us, and stay safe. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.